He thought he was in control of the situation, but control is a dangerous illusion when truth is watching from the shadows. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk as Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of his patrol car, his posture stiff, his eyes already locked onto the woman standing beside a sleek black sedan. She didn't move when he approached, didn't fidget, didn't even glance away, just stood there with a calm that felt almost out of place in a moment like this. And that alone made him uneasy, though he'd never admit it, because in his world, people either explained themselves quickly or gave him a reason to push harder, and she was doing neither. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle and show some identification." His voice carried authority, practiced, the kind that expected obedience without question. But she didn't reach for her bag, didn't argue, didn't even sigh. She simply looked at him, steady and composed, as if she'd already seen how this would end. And that silence, that refusal to react, began to draw attention. A couple walking by slowed their pace. A man across the street lifted his phone slightly, not obvious, but enough. The air shifted in that subtle way it does when something feels off, but no one says it out loud. Daniel took a step closer, narrowing the space between them. "You heard me, right?" he added, sharper now, a hint of irritation slipping through, because compliance was supposed to be immediate, unquestioned. And yet she stood there like the rules didn't quite apply the same way, like she wasn't playing the role he had already assigned to her. "I heard you," she finally said, her voice even, controlled, not defensive, not afraid, just clear. And that somehow made it worse, because it wasn't resistance he could push against. It was something else, something quieter, something that made him feel like he was the one being watched instead. "Then don't make this harder than it needs to be," he replied, gesturing toward the car, the metal of his badge catching a flicker of sunlight, as if to remind everyone nearby who held the authority here. But her eyes didn't follow the gesture. They stayed on him, unshaken, unbothered. And for a brief second, just a second, there was a flicker of doubt, quickly buried, quickly replaced by the routine he trusted, the script he'd followed 100 times before, because this was simple. It was always simple, until it wasn't. "Officer," she said softly, not raising her voice, not stepping back, "you might want to think twice about what you do next." And the words weren't a threat. They didn't sound like one, but something in the way she said them lingered in the air longer than they should have, like a warning wrapped in calm. And behind them, just barely noticeable, a dark SUV slowed at the corner, engine humming low, waiting, watching, while Daniel exhaled, dismissing the feeling, because from where he stood, this was still his moment, his call, his authority, and he had no idea that every second unfolding in front of him had already been seen, already been noted, already been set into motion long before he ever stepped out of his car. Daniel Brooks did not respond right away, not because he did not have something to say, but because something about her tone refused to fit into the version of reality he was used to controlling. And for a brief moment the street felt quieter than it should have, like the city itself had paused to watch what would happen next. But routine is a powerful thing, and Daniel had built his confidence on it. So he straightened his shoulders, exhaled slowly, and leaned into the authority he trusted more than instinct. "I am not here to think twice," he said, his voice firm, measured, the kind that was meant to close conversations, not open them. "I am here to do my job." And with that, he reached for his radio, speaking codes and information with practiced precision, requesting a background check as if the outcome had already been decided, as if the answer would simply confirm what he believed from the start. And across from him, Ava Carter did not interrupt, did not protest. She simply shifted her weight slightly, the smallest movement, but deliberate, controlled, like someone who understood exactly how much space to take and no more, her eyes never leaving his. And that steady gaze began to draw more attention than his uniform ever could, because people notice calm in moments of tension. They notice the person who does not react when everyone expects them to. And slowly the sidewalk filled with that quiet curiosity, the kind that grows without sound. A man paused mid-step. A woman lowered her sunglasses just enough to see more clearly. And somewhere behind them a car door closed softly, almost too soft to register. But it did. It registered somewhere beneath the surface of the moment. Even if no one turned to look, Daniel's radio crackled back to life, static first, then a voice, routine, distant, listing details in a tone that sounded almost bored. But Daniel's expression did not change, not yet, because nothing unusual had been said, nothing that would challenge his position, and he nodded slightly, as if confirming his own expectations. "That is what I thought," he muttered, more to himself than to her, and for a second it looked like the moment would resolve exactly the way he intended. Predictable, controlled, finished. But then the voice on the radio shifted, just slightly, the cadence tightening, the words more careful, more precise, as if someone else had stepped into the conversation without being seen, and Daniel's grip on the device adjusted, almost unconsciously. "Repeat that," he said, this time not as confident, not as certain, and Ava noticed it. Not with a smile, not with any visible reaction, but with a subtle change in her posture, a quiet acknowledgement that something had begun, something that had been waiting beneath the surface from the very start. And across the street the dark SUV idled, its engine a low hum against the rhythm of the city, doors still closed, windows dark, but presence unmistakable now if anyone chose to see it. And still Ava said nothing, because she did not need to. Because whatever was coming did not require her to argue or explain or defend herself. It required patience, and patience was something Daniel was beginning to lose, even if he did not realize it yet. Because the situation was no longer moving in a straight line, it was shifting, bending, becoming something he could not quite predict. And in that uncertainty, there was a tension he could not control, a silence that felt heavier than any accusation. And as the radio crackled again, sharper this time, calling for confirmation with a tone that did not match routine procedure, Daniel felt it. That subtle shift, the moment where authority starts to feel less like control and more like exposure. But he pushed it down, because from where he stood he still believed he was in charge. He still believed this would end the way it always did. He just did not know that for the first time. He was already part of something much bigger than himself. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like a pressure change you could feel before you could explain it. And Daniel Brooks felt it in the way his radio no longer sounded routine, in the way the voice on the other end stopped sounding casual and started sounding careful, like every word suddenly mattered more than it should. "Officer Brooks, confirm your location," the voice said, slower this time, more deliberate, and Daniel frowned slightly, glancing around as if the answer might be written somewhere in the scene he thought he controlled. "I am on Maple and 3rd, he replied, his tone still steady but no longer relaxed, and across from him Ava Carter did not move, did not speak, but there was something different now, something almost imperceptible, like a quiet recognition that the moment had begun to turn, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to shift. The balance in a way Daniel could not yet define. The crowd had grown thicker now, not close enough to interfere, but close enough to witness. Phones raised a little higher, whispers a little more frequent, because people could sense when a situation was no longer ordinary, when something underneath it was starting to surface, and that curiosity held them there, watching, waiting, as if they understood that leaving now would mean missing the truth when it finally revealed itself. Daniel adjusted his stance, his hand tightening slightly around the radio. "Is there a problem?" he asked, and the question came out sharper than he intended, because uncertainty had begun to edge into his voice, even if he tried to cover it with authority. There was a pause on the other end, not static, not interference, just a pause, the kind that stretches longer than expected, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. And then the response came, quieter, controlled, "Stand by." And those two words landed differently than any command he had heard before, because they did not direct him forward, they held him in place. And for the first time since stepping out of his car, Daniel was not moving. The situation was holding him, and that realization flickered behind his eyes for just a second before he pushed it away, because that was not how this worked, not for him, not in his experience. And yet the evidence was right there in front of him, in the stillness of Ava Carter, in the growing attention of the crowd, in the presence of the dark SUV, now clearly visible at the edge of the scene. Its engine still running, its doors still closed, but no longer hidden, no longer just background noise. And Daniel noticed it now, really noticed it, his gaze shifting briefly toward it before returning to Ava, as if trying to connect something he could not quite articulate. "Do you know who was in that vehicle?" he asked, his voice lower now, less commanding, more searching, and Ava tilted her head just slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just enough to acknowledge the question without answering it. "You already have everything you need," she said, her tone unchanged, calm, steady. And that answer did not give him control. It took it further away, because it suggested something had already been decided, something he was only now beginning to step into. And the radio crackled again, louder this time, more urgent. "Officer Brooks, do not proceed further," the voice said, clear, unmistakable. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that single instruction, because it contradicted everything he had been doing, everything he believed he was supposed to do. And in that contradiction there was a crack, small but real, in the certainty he had relied on. And as he stood there, caught between the command in his hand and the silence in front of him, the door of the SUV opened, slow, deliberate, and whatever was about to step out was not part of his plan, not part of his control, and deep down, whether he admitted it or not, Daniel knew that nothing after this moment would feel the same again. The door of the SUV did not swing open with urgency. It moved slowly, controlled, the kind of movement that carried intention rather than reaction. And as it opened fully, a man stepped out in a dark suit, his posture straight, his expression unreadable, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be felt. And the moment his shoes touched the pavement, something in the atmosphere shifted again, deeper this time, heavier, like a quiet confirmation that whatever had been building was no longer hidden. Daniel Brooks turned fully toward the vehicle now, his focus pulled away from Ava Carter for the first time since the encounter began. And that alone said more than any words could have, because control is often measured by where your attention stays, and his had just been redirected. The man from the SUV did not rush, did not raise his voice. He simply walked forward with measured steps, each one steady, deliberate, closing the distance between himself and the scene as if he had done this before, as if this moment was not unexpected but scheduled, planned, inevitable. The crowd noticed too. Conversations faded into whispers, phones lifted higher, because people recognize authority even when it does not wear a uniform. And this was a different kind of authority, quieter, but unmistakable. Daniel's radio remained in his hand, still active, still connected, but no longer guiding him, because now there was something in front of him that demanded his attention more than any voice through static ever could. "Sir, this is an active situation," Daniel said, stepping slightly forward, trying to reclaim space, trying to re-establish the boundaries he believed were his to define. But the man did not stop, did not hesitate. He simply continued walking until he stood just a few feet away, close enough that the details became clear, the small pin on his lapel, the calm focus in his eyes, the kind of composure that does not come from confidence alone but from certainty. And then he spoke, not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly. "That is exactly why I am here." And those words landed differently than any challenge Daniel had faced before, because they did not oppose him, they replaced him. And for a moment Daniel did not respond, not because he did not want to, but because he did not immediately know how. And that pause stretched just long enough for everything around him to feel different. The sidewalk, the crowd, even the air. Ava Carter remained where she was, still, composed, watching not the man who had approached, but Daniel himself, as if the focus had always been here, always been on this moment, and not on anything that came before it. The man reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and produced a badge, holding it just enough for Daniel to see, not forcing it, not presenting it like proof, but like confirmation of something that had already been set into motion. "Internal affairs," he said, his voice calm, precise, and the words did not echo. They settled, heavy and final, and Daniel felt it. That shift he had been resisting, that quiet pressure turning into something real, something unavoidable, because internal affairs did not arrive by coincidence. It did not appear for routine stops. It arrived when something deeper was already in question, and for the first time since the beginning of this encounter, Daniel's certainty did not return. It faltered, just slightly, just enough to be felt. His grip on the radio loosened, his stance adjusted, not dramatically, but enough to show that the balance had changed, and behind him the city continued to move. Cars passing, people walking, life carrying on as it always did. But within this moment, everything had slowed, narrowed, focused on a single realization that had not yet been spoken out loud. And as the man lowered his badge and met Daniel's eyes directly, there was no hostility there, no anger, just a calm that carried weight. "Officer Brooks," he said, using his name with quiet precision, "we need to talk." And in that instant it became clear that this was never just about a stop on a street, never just about a question or a response. It was about something that had been building long before this moment, something Daniel had stepped into without seeing, and now, standing in front of it, he could no longer pretend that he was the one in control. Daniel Brooks did not answer immediately, and that silence said more than any defense he could have offered, because for the first time since stepping into this moment, he was no longer responding from instinct. He was calculating, measuring, trying to understand how something that began so routinely had shifted into something he could not control. The man from Internal Affairs stood steady in front of him, not impatient, not aggressive, just present, as if time itself had slowed to match his pace. "We can talk right here," Daniel finally said, his voice firm but lower than before, less certain, as though he was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping. But the man shook his head slightly, not dismissive, just precise. "No, Officer Brooks, we cannot," he replied, and there was something in that calm correction that carried authority beyond rank, beyond protocol, something that made it clear this was no longer a situation Daniel could direct. The crowd felt it too. The shift from confrontation to something deeper, something quieter but more serious. Phones still raised, but the energy had changed. Less curiosity now, more anticipation. Because whatever was happening was no longer about a simple interaction. It was about something being revealed, something that had been hidden in plain sight. Daniel glanced briefly toward Ava Carter, and for the first time since their eyes met, there was a question in his look, not accusation, not authority, but uncertainty, and Ava did not respond with words. She did not need to. Her expression remained calm, grounded, as if she had already accepted every outcome long before this moment arrived, and that calmness, that refusal to react, began to settle into the space around them like a quiet truth no one had yet spoken. "What is this about?" Daniel asked, directing the question toward the man in front of him, but the answer did not come from him right away. Instead, the man glanced briefly toward Ava, a small acknowledgement, almost imperceptible, but meaningful, as if confirming that everything was proceeding exactly as it should, and only then did he return his attention to Daniel. "It is about a pattern," he said, his tone steady, each word deliberate, one that has been under review for some time. And the phrase did not sound like speculation, it sounded like documentation, like something recorded, tracked, analyzed, and Daniel felt it, that subtle tightening in his chest, not fear, not yet, but recognition, because patterns are not built in a single moment. They are formed over time, through repetition, through decisions made when no one seems to be watching, and the realization that someone had been watching, that something had been building, began to press against the certainty he had relied on for so long. "There has to be some kind of misunderstanding," he said, the words coming out quickly now, not rushed, but closer to defense than command, and the man did not interrupt, did not challenge. He simply listened, allowing the silence after Daniel's words to settle, because sometimes silence reveals more than interruption ever could. And in that silence, Ava Carter finally shifted slightly, just enough to step forward half a pace, not to take control, not to confront, but to stand fully within the moment that had always belonged to her. "There is no misunderstanding," she said quietly, her voice calm, unwavering, and when she spoke it was not to argue, it was to confirm, and Daniel turned toward her again. But this time the dynamic had changed, because he was no longer questioning her place. He was beginning to question his own, and the man from Internal Affairs reached into his jacket once more, not for a badge this time, but for a small folder, thin, organized, the kind that holds information rather than authority, and he opened it with measured care, revealing documents that did not need to be read aloud to carry weight. "Everything you have said, everything you have done, it has all been noted," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. And the words did not echo, they settled, heavy and quiet, because the truth does not need volume to be heard. And as the city continued around them, cars passing, people moving, life unchanged in the distance, within this moment something had shifted completely, something irreversible, and Daniel Brooks stood at the center of it, no longer directing the scene, no longer controlling the narrative, but finally beginning to understand that the moment he thought he was creating had actually been waiting for him all along. The folder did not move in Daniel Brooks's direction right away. It remained in the man's hands, slightly open, just enough to reveal that what was inside was not random, not recent, but structured, organized, deliberate. And that detail alone carried a weight Daniel could feel without needing to read a single line. Because organization means time, and time means intention, and intention means this moment had not started here on this sidewalk. It had been building long before he ever stepped out of his patrol car. "You have been under observation for weeks," the man said, his tone steady, not accusatory, just factual. And those words did not land like a confrontation. They landed like a conclusion, like the final piece of something already decided. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not out of anger, but out of realization, because observation does not happen without reason, and patterns do not form without repetition. And suddenly the confidence he had relied on began to feel less like strength and more like something exposed, something examined, from angles he had never considered. "That is not possible," he replied, but the words lacked force, lacked the certainty they would have carried minutes ago, and the man did not challenge him, did not correct him. He simply let the statement exist in the air for a moment before responding. "It is already documented," he said, and with that he turned one page in the folder, a simple motion, quiet, controlled, but final in a way that made it clear this was not a discussion, this was a record. And across from them Ava Carter stood unchanged, her presence steady, her expression calm, but now there was something more visible in her posture, not pride, not satisfaction, but resolution, as if the role she had been holding silently was now fully understood without needing to be explained. Daniel looked at her again, longer this time, searching for something he had missed, something he had overlooked, and for the first time he saw it, not in her clothing, not in her stance, but in her composure, the kind that does not come from chance, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand in a situation even when others do not. "You knew," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them, not a question, not fully an accusation, but something in between, and Ava met his gaze without hesitation. "I knew this moment would come," she answered, her voice quiet, unwavering. And that answer did not escalate anything. It settled it, because it confirmed what had been building beneath the surface all along. The man from Internal Affairs closed the folder gently, not with emphasis, not with force, just enough to mark a transition. "Commander Carter has been leading this review," he said, and the title landed with precision, cutting through any remaining uncertainty. And in that instant the structure of the situation became clear, not suddenly, but fully, like a picture coming into focus after being blurred for too long. Daniel's shoulders shifted slightly, not collapsing, not reacting dramatically, but adjusting, because understanding changes posture before it changes words, and the crowd felt it too. The shift from tension to revelation, from questioning to clarity. Because people do not always understand details, but they recognize when truth surfaces, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was aware. The man stepped half a pace closer, still calm, still measured. "You are not being judged here on this street," he continued. "This is simply where the process reached you." And that distinction mattered, because it separated the moment from the outcome. It made it clear that what was happening now was not the beginning or the end, but the point where everything unseen became visible. Daniel lowered his gaze for just a second, not in defeat, but in recognition. And when he looked back up, there was no anger, no resistance, just a quiet realization that the authority he thought he held had never been the highest one present. And Ava Carter remained exactly where she had been from the start, calm, steady, unshaken, because she had never needed to take control. She had only needed to wait for it to reveal itself. For a moment no one spoke. Not Daniel Brooks, not the man from Internal Affairs, not even the crowd that had gathered around them. Because there are moments when words only get in the way of understanding, and this was one of them, the kind of moment where everything that needed to be said had already been revealed without being spoken out loud. and Daniel stood there, still holding the same position he had taken at the beginning, but it no longer meant the same thing, because posture without control is just a shape, and he could feel that difference now, subtle but undeniable. "What happens now?" he finally asked. And the question was not directed at Ava Carter, not anymore. It was directed at the process, at the structure he had always believed he understood, but was only now beginning to see from the outside. The man from Internal Affairs did not answer immediately, not because he was unsure, but because he did not rush. Every movement he made had been measured from the moment he stepped out of the vehicle, and that consistency carried through even now. "Now we proceed," he said, his tone calm, almost neutral. But the simplicity of the words held weight, because proceeding means there is already a path, already a direction, already a destination that does not depend on how anyone feels in the moment. And Daniel nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because there was nothing else to do, no argument that would shift what had already been set into motion. And across from him, Ava Carter took a small step forward, not toward him, not toward the man, but into the space between them, into the center of the moment that had always belonged to her. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm it had from the beginning, but now it was clearer, more defined, because it no longer needed to remain in the background. "This was never about one interaction," she said, and the words settled over the scene with quiet clarity. "It was about understanding how decisions are made when no one believes they are being observed." And that sentence did not accuse, it explained. It framed everything that had happened not as a mistake, but as part of something larger, something that extended beyond a single moment on a sidewalk. Daniel listened, not interrupting, not responding, because the explanation did not require his input. It required his understanding, and that understanding was beginning to take shape whether he wanted it to or not. The man from Internal Affairs shifted slightly, opening the folder again, not to present evidence, but to continue the process. "You will be asked to provide a statement," he said, his tone steady, procedural, "and you will be placed on administrative review effective immediately." And the words were not dramatic. They were not delivered with emphasis, but they carried consequence, because consequences do not need volume. They need clarity, and Daniel absorbed them quietly, his expression controlled, but no longer rigid, because rigidity requires certainty, and certainty was no longer available to him. The crowd remained, watching, but now their presence felt different, less intrusive, more like witnesses to something that had already reached its conclusion, and the city continued around them, unaware, unchanged. Because most moments like this do not stop the world, they simply redefine the space they exist within. Ava Carter looked at Daniel one last time, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with something closer to recognition, as if acknowledging that this moment was not just about what had happened, but about what would follow. "The truth does not rush," she said quietly, and the words were not directed at anyone in particular, but they carried through the space all the same. "It waits until it is seen." And with that, the moment did not end. It shifted again, moving forward, continuing, because what had been revealed here was not the final chapter. It was the beginning of everything that would come next. The movement that followed was not sudden, not chaotic. It unfolded with a quiet precision that made it feel almost inevitable, as if every step had already been decided long before anyone realized it. The man from Internal Affairs closed the folder once more, not as an ending, but as a transition, and gestured subtly toward the SUV, not commanding, not forcing, simply indicating the next step in a process that no longer required explanation. Daniel Brooks hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not out of defiance, but out of habit, because hesitation is what happens when control is no longer yours, but your instincts have not caught up yet. And in that brief pause, he glanced once more at the street around him. The familiar setting that had always reinforced his sense of authority now felt different, not hostile, not threatening, just distant, like something he was no longer standing above but within. The crowd had begun to shift as well, not dispersing completely, but loosening, their attention no longer fixed on a confrontation, but on a resolution they had already witnessed, phones lowering, whispers softening, because the moment of tension had passed, and what remained was understanding. And understanding does not demand noise. Ava Carter remained still for a beat longer, allowing the space to settle before she moved. And when she did, it was not toward the vehicle, not toward Daniel, but slightly to the side, positioning herself in a way that reflected exactly what she had been from the start. Not an obstacle, not a participant in conflict, but the center of a process that had now fully revealed itself. "You will have time to review everything," the man said to Daniel, his voice measured, procedural, but not unkind, because this was not about punishment in the moment. It was about accountability over time, and Daniel nodded again, more naturally this time, because the resistance that might have existed before had nowhere to anchor itself anymore. There was no misunderstanding left to hold on to, no uncertainty to argue against, only the quiet clarity of what had been laid out in front of him. And as he took a step forward, moving in the direction indicated, it was not with the confidence he had earlier, but with something more grounded, more aware, the kind of movement that comes when you understand that the situation is no longer yours to define. The door of the SUV remained open, waiting, not as a symbol of force, but as part of a process that had already begun, and as Daniel approached it, he slowed slightly, not out of fear, but out of reflection, because moments like this do not pass without leaving something behind, something that reshapes how you see what came before and what will come after. Ava watched him for a moment, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the purpose of this moment had been fulfilled, not in a dramatic reversal, but in a clear one, the kind that does not rely on reaction, only on truth. And as the man from internal affairs moved to follow, he paused briefly beside Ava, just long enough for a single exchange that did not need to be heard to be understood, a slight nod, a shared recognition of completion. Before he continued forward, the SUV door closed softly once Daniel was inside, not with a slam, not with urgency, just a quiet finality that matched everything that had led up to it. And as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, blending back into the rhythm of the city, it did not leave chaos behind. It left clarity, the kind that lingers longer than noise ever could. The crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their paths, their conversations, their lives, but carrying with them the memory of what they had seen, not just a moment of authority challenged, but a moment of truth revealed. And Ava Carter remained where she was for a few seconds longer, the street now quieter, the energy settled, and when she finally turned to walk away, it was without hesitation, without pause, because her role in this moment had never been to react, only to ensure that when the truth arrived, it would be seen clearly, and somewhere behind her, unseen but undeniable, the echo of that truth remained, steady and unshaken, waiting for the next moment when it would be needed again. The street returned to its rhythm, but something in the air had changed, not visibly, not in a way that could be measured, but in the way people carried themselves as they moved forward, as if they had witnessed something that would stay with them longer than they expected. Ava Carter walked slowly along the sidewalk, her steps steady, unhurried, not because she needed time, but because she understood the weight of what had just unfolded, not as a moment of victory, but as a moment of clarity. And clarity does not rush. It settles, it lingers, it reshapes everything around it without making a sound. Behind her, the space where the encounter had taken place looked no different than it had before. The same pavement, the same passing cars, the same distant hum of the city, but the meaning of that space had shifted, because meaning is not held in the place itself, it is held in what is revealed there. And what had been revealed was not just about one officer or one decision. It was about how easily perception can shape reality when it goes unquestioned, and how powerful it becomes when it finally is. Ava paused for just a second near the corner, not to look back, but to acknowledge the moment in her own way, quiet, internal, the kind of pause that does not seek attention but recognizes significance, because moments like this are not defined by what is seen, but by what is understood, and understanding takes time, far beyond the few minutes it occupies in the present. Somewhere across the city, the SUV continued its path, carrying Daniel Brooks into a process that would not be resolved in a single conversation, a process that would require him to look not just at what had happened on that street, but at the patterns that had led him there, the decisions made without pause, the assumptions accepted without question. And for the first time, those patterns would not exist in isolation. They would be examined, placed into context, understood for what they were rather than what they had been assumed to be. And that kind of reflection is not immediate. It unfolds slowly, sometimes uncomfortably, because it requires a shift, not just in action, but in awareness. And awareness, once it arrives, does not easily leave. Back on the sidewalk, Ava resumed walking, blending into the flow of people, no longer the center of attention, no longer the focal point of a moment, just another figure moving forward. And that was exactly how it was meant to be, because her role had never been to stand above the moment, only to ensure that when the truth arrived, it would be clear, unobstructed, undeniable. A quiet echo of her earlier words lingered, not spoken again, but present all the same. The truth does not rush. It waits until it is seen, and now it had been seen. Not through confrontation, not through force, but through patience, through observation, through a calm that never needed to raise its voice to be heard. The city moved on, as it always does, but moments like this do not disappear. They become part of something larger, something that shapes the way future moments unfold. Because once a pattern is revealed, it cannot return to being invisible. And once awareness is established, it changes the way decisions are made, even when no one is watching. And somewhere within that understanding, beyond the noise of daily life, beyond the routine of movement and motion, there remains a quiet reminder that power is not defined by who speaks first or who stands tallest, but by who sees clearly when it matters most. And in that clarity, in that stillness where truth finally surfaces, the balance shifts, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a way that cannot be undone, because the moment he thought he was in control was never really his. It was simply the moment truth chose to reveal itself.